So what is policy? So policy is mainly guidelines. It guides decisions and behavior. And it could be formal or informal. So the policy statements is essentially saying, this is what we want our ecosystem, why we want an ecosystem, and this is what the ecosystem should be focusing on. I showed you the example of the African space policy. Now, the way what I say about formal and informal, on the formal side, these are policy statements that are documented. On the informal side, it might come back to how does a country behave? What are the cultural values in the country? And sometimes when you violate the cultural norm, it could be an issue. So it's an informal aspects. Certain cultures want to do things in different ways. And you have to get used to that informal way of working. So for example, I've been used to the South African context, the African context. When I come to Saudi Arabia, slightly different context, slightly different way of working. It's informal, it's not written, but it's there. And when you're looking at it from a policy perspective, you have to work around the informal, not just the formal as well. It has also geared towards producing specific impact outcomes. Remember the theory of change? It's at the top end. It makes specific statements around the impacts that we want or the outcomes we want to be delivered. And then the consequences can be foreseen or unforeseen. Okay. Now this is a very important point, colleagues, because remember I said any government should be looking at the social, the economic, the sustainable, which is the environmental issues. And you need to balance that. You don't want to make a decision on the social that has a negative effect on the economic. Okay? So certain consequences can be seen or foreseen, and certain ones you can't foresee them. And this is one of the reasons why in certain countries or institutions, when you develop a policy, it's mandated that you have to do what is called an impact assessment. Take your policy statement or your policy document, and you have to then go through a formal process of documenting, if I take this policy forward, what are the consequences, whether it's adverse or beneficial. Okay, so I want to look at consequences from that perspective. So impact assessments are very key to assessing the effectiveness of policies as well. And they can be used to shape public law and regulations. So sometimes, when you institute a policy, over time that policy could be turned into law and regulations. So just to give you a sense, you could have a set of policies. Let's say there's a water body. I'm looking at the quality, water quality. I could introduce specific policies to improve the quality of water in this water body. Okay? And it becomes so effective that I think it's so necessary that I now introduce laws or regulation that enforces people to behave in a certain way. That if you violate it, then there's consequences. Okay, so public policy can also be used to shape law and regulations. You see that in the health sector as well. We introduce a new policy. When it starts working, we want to regulate it, change it embed it into the legal instruments of the country. So the difference between policy and law differentiates between what is legal and illegal. Okay, it has consequences. If you break the law, there are certain punitive measures that will be instituted. Okay, like if I run a stop street and if I get caught, I have to pay a fine. There's a punitive measure associated with that. Policy, on the other hand, does not necessarily have legal consequences. Okay, so for example, we have HR policies that says we work from 8 to 4. The moment you come in late at 8:30 doesn't mean that you're going to have certain consequences. You will be warned. You might have several warnings before action is taken. Even then, you will not be dismissed from your job. Okay, there might be some remedial actions. Eventually, if you keep doing this over and over again, then there will be consequences. But the policy itself does not necessarily, in the first instance, have a legal consequence, whereas law does. Okay, and that's one of the key differences between the policy and law.